Linux gets better every year. What should we expect from Linux in 2019? We're going to discuss that today. Compromised packages, viruses, malware, becoming more and more commonplace in Linux. I'm going to discuss two of the recent compromises in Linux. The alternatives to Windows 10. If you're tired of the broken updates in Windows 10 and you want to move on to a different operating system, what are your options? Bring in the ads. YouTube may let everyone watch its original shows and films for free. Discover your perfect Linux distro with this online tool. Today I'm going to share with you a website that lets you find your perfect Linux distro. Does it really work? I don't know. I'm going to go through the process myself here on camera. I'm going to see what distro it recommends for me. These are 5 stories that I will be taking into account. And the first story on the docket tonight is, what should we expect of Linux in 2019? So this article from Network World, written by Sandra Henry Stocker, and as always, I'm going to link to all the articles we discuss in the show description. Faster, more versatile, and secure. Linux gets better every year. Let's take a look at some of the highlights expected in the upcoming 2019. So, first of all, the premise is absolutely right. Linux does get better every single year. Linux is vastly superior as a desktop operating system than what it was 5 years ago. It's definitely much, much better than it was 10 years ago. Those of you that go back even further than that, I'm sure, it's just night and day difference, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. So we do keep making very, very big leaps forward in Linux. Reading a little bit of this article, 2019 might be the year of Linux. We're talking about the year of desktop Linux. I really wish people would quit throwing that out there, but who knows? Maybe it's coming. I doubt it, though. Anyway, the year in which Linux is fully recognized as the powerhouse it has become. Well, Sandra here doesn't mention desktop Linux. If she's just talking about the year of Linux, we've been there. So we already dominate, of course, mobile, server, cloud. We just own everything. The Internet of Things, embedded devices, and of course newer technologies that are coming about. AI is going to be the next big thing. Linux is going to dominate that. And I'm assuming that's probably where Sandra is going here, since, again, that opening paragraph did not mention anything about desktop Linux. Anyway, Linux behind the scenes. The fact is, most people today are using Linux without ever knowing it, whether on their phones. I think most people do not know that Android, which is the most popular operating system on the planet, is Linux. Now, it's not GNU/Linux. It's not your desktop Linux. But Android, of course, does use a Linux kernel. Most people also, in the article here, Sandra mentions that when you're online, most people don't realize that those websites that they spend hours a day on, things like Facebook and Twitter and what have you, YouTube, all those servers that are serving up these websites to you, guess what they run? They run Linux. The web basically runs Linux. When you're on the internet, you are using Linux. All those servers, those web servers, they're all running Linux. You may be running a Windows machine or a Mac, at home, but the web is all Linux. Your cars, your like smart devices and your vehicles, for the most part, are all Linux. Toyota, by the way, is a platinum member of the Linux Foundation. Why? It's for reasons regarding this, is that these devices and these Toyota vehicles, just mentioning that particular manufacturer, depends on Linux. That's why they donate money. They support Linux financially. Most IoT and embedded devices, we've already mentioned. IoT is becoming a bigger and bigger market, and Linux dominates that. Linux dominates the cloud. According to the Cloud Industry Forum, for the first time, businesses are spending more and more on cloud than on internal infrastructure. Cloud is taking over the role that data centers used to play. And in particular, they mention, we discussed this a few weeks ago, that Microsoft's Azure, the most popular operating system on Microsoft's Azure, is Linux. More than 50% of Microsoft Azure is Linux. It's not Windows. So Gartner here, I'm not exactly sure who Gartner is. I think they quoted, it may have been from the Cloud Industry Forum. Anyway, they state that 80% of internally developed software is now either cloud enabled or cloud native. Cloud native software specifically built to run on the cloud. The Linux Foundation is a key collaborator, of course, in cloud native computing. All of this, what are we going to see in 2019? We're going to see the formation of, quote, data lakes. That's large collections of data, largely in a raw format without transformation or loss. We're going to see Linux and supercomputing. We already know the top 500 supercomputers in the world, they all run Linux. In 2019, Sierra, I guess it's the latest, like, new bad-ass supercomputer, right? Sierra is going to be the second fastest supercomputer in the world. It's going to run Red Hat. So we already know supercomputing, Linux dominates. It's the only game in town, really. Pretty much, like I said, all the top 500 supercomputers run Linux. Linux is going to be the driving force behind AI. Again, AI is going to be the next big technology. Linux is going to basically power AI. Things to look forward in 2019. We're going to see Debian 10 Buster released sometime in 2019, maybe. Debian doesn't have that strict of a release schedule. It's released mainly when it's ready, but sometime mid-2019 we should see Debian 10, which is going to be, of course, a gigantic distro release. Ubuntu, of course, is going to have a couple of releases in 2019, but they will not be LTS releases, so I wouldn't expect those to be major players or major news stories. I mean, 1904 and 1910 both will come out next year, but other than, running the latest kernel, updated software, shouldn't see any major changes with mainline Ubuntu. Fedora 20 will be out April or May 2019. Fedora is another distro. They do have a release schedule, but they never stick to it. They rarely ever ship a distro on time, but sometime in 2019, we should get Fedora 30. We're going to see kernel version 5.0 sometime in 2019. That's really entirely up to Linus Torvalds. One day he's going to wake up and say, you know what, the next kernel version, we're just going to go ahead and skip to the 5 series. And so, we're going to have 420 coming out soon, 421, 422, maybe sometime next year he'll get to like 430 and he'll decide, you know what, let's not do 431, let's do 5.0. So it's completely just, up to Linus. There's no rhyme or reason when they change these kernel version numbers, the major version numbers. So major conferences that are happening in 2019, which this is great. I really love that she added all these Linux conferences, locations, dates. If you guys never attended a Linux conference and you're interested, I strongly suggest you check out some of this list here. That actually is just, that makes reading this article worthwhile for those of you interested in that. So that is a little what we should expect of Linux in 2019. I will throw something else out there that Sandra didn't mention. Expect Canonical to be bought from some other large corporation in 2019. And don't be surprised if that corporation starts with an M as far as the name. Just throwing it out there. And the second story on the docket tonight is compromised packages in Linux. So we're seeing more and more of these. We're seeing, viruses and Trojans and malware in Linux. It used to be just a Windows problem for the most part. Then the last few years, we've really seen an uptick in malware, especially on Mac OS. It's becoming a big deal. These past few months, especially now that I'm paying more attention to some of the Linux news out there, it seems that every week we have one or two of these stories where some package has been compromised in some way in Linux, and there's a couple I want to discuss with you guys this week. So this story over at medium.com, written by Thomas Hunter II, is about a compromised NPM package. So those of you that use NPM to install packages, the package that was compromised is event-stream is the name of the package. Event-stream. A lot of you probably have never heard of that particular program, that package. I haven't either, but it is a pretty popular package. So event-stream was transferred by the original author to a malicious user. His username was Right in Control. Anyway, this package receives over 1.5 million weekly downloads. It is dependent on nearly 1,600 other packages. So 1,600 other packages depend on event-stream. It is a dependency. So a very popular package, right? It's on a lot of people's machines. So this malicious user was able to gain the trust of the original author because he made a bunch of contributions to the package. He made meaningful contributions. So he contributed code. He actually helped improve the product, right? So the original author, trusted him, basically gave him the keys to the car. And, this is where the malicious user was able to modify event-stream to depend on a malicious package of his own called flatmap-stream. This package was specifically crafted for the purposes of basically taking over the computer so it could run a cryptocurrency miner of some kind. I'm not exactly sure what this particular thing mines for, Bitcoin, Monero, one of those cryptocurrencies. Anyway, there is no requirement that code being uploaded in a npm module is equivalent to the code stored publicly in a Git repository. So this is highlighted. So let me read this in context here. So in the published npm package, the minified version of the file has additional code injected into it. There is no requirement that code being uploaded in an npm module is equivalent to the code stored publicly in a Git repository. So that code you're looking at in the Git repository is not the same as what he was sending out. So that is one of the ways he kind of threw a curveball there and was able to, I guess, avoid detection for a little bit. Anyway, event-stream, if you guys have been, especially if you've been installing anything as far as npm packages, look for event-stream. Another story I came across is this one from the Inquirer. This Linux virus is a total jerk, even by malware standards. And this is interesting because, a lot of these compromised packages, especially the people that are installing malware, these Linux exploits, a lot of them are kind of amateurish. They look like an 8th grader, coded these things. It's usually just a few lines. Usually it's bad code. Usually they leave like crazy comments, like elite hacker, it commented above the line. They want people to know, hey, I just, hacked your machine. This is actually pretty professional in nature. This particular bit of malware comprised of over 1,000 lines of code. It's particularly malicious thanks to the number of ways it attacks the host computer. So it's not just, one way it attacks the machine. It anticipates certain things. It anticipates, for example, you might have an antivirus program installed on Linux. There are antivirus clients that run natively on Linux. Guess what? This particular piece of malware disables those. So in case your malware could detect it, because it's out there publicly now, this particular malware is called linux.btcmine.174. Anyway, you had antivirus that would detect it. Well, we turned that off as soon as we installed the malware on your system. The main function of the malware is to mine for cryptocurrency, in this case, Monero. But even before it gets to that point, once it's on the machine, the first thing it does at the start of the infection, it has to find some folder on your machine that has write permissions so that it can copy itself and start downloading all the additional modules it needs. So it finds one directory somewhere on your computer that has write permissions, and that's how it kind of starts. Then it tries a couple of privilege escalation exploits, including Dirty Cow. That's an interesting name, Dirty Cow. Anyway, somehow it will obtain root access, giving it root permission. Once it has root permission, the game is over. If I have root permission, I can install and delete anything on your computer. I can move, copy, remove files, anything I want to. I can do anything I want to the system. And that is where this DDoS malware strain that I guess they are calling the Bill Gates Trojan. I like that name too. That's colorful names here regarding this one. Anyway, the Trojan adds itself as an auto-run entry to various files, downloads and runs a rootkit, and of course, again, it disables any AV programs you may have running on your system. And the third story on the docket tonight, the alternatives to Windows 10. If you are tired of all those broken updates in Windows 10, along with all the other shenanigans, what are your options? Well, I will go ahead and warn you guys, your options are rather limited. As far as viable options, as far as another operating system. By the way, this article is from My Broadband, written by Jamie McCann. Anyway, Windows operating system remains the most popular in the world. Yeah, like 90% of the world runs Microsoft Windows on their desktop. Now, not all of them are running Windows 10, but a large percentage of them are running the latest Microsoft Windows 10. Windows 10 continues to gain popularity. It becomes more and more popular every year as more and more people move away from past versions of Windows 7 in particular. Because eventually you're going to have to get off Windows 7. Eventually you either have to make that move to Windows 10 or some later version of Windows, whatever they come out with next. Or you're going to have to move to a different operating system. And a lot of Windows users, especially those that stuck with Windows 7 because they didn't like Windows 10, a lot of them probably are looking at alternatives, and a lot of people that did make the switch to Windows 10 may be looking for alternatives now because Windows 10, these forced updates that sometimes break your system are, as the article suggests, tiring. These are getting old for a lot of people. Also, certain updates recently started deleting user files on the system. You do this update and it deletes user files that were once installed. That's not okay. That's not okay on any operating system, right? If that happened to me on one of my Linux distros, I did an update and you know what, it deleted, something in my home directory, personal data of mine that was irreplaceable, even if I had a backup. But I couldn't trust that operating system anymore, right? I would have to move to something else just for peace of mind. Anyway, what are your options if you're tired of falling prey to all the bugs in Windows 10, not to mention the privacy and security issues with Windows 10? There are really only two major options, according to this article, and you know what, I agree. There really are only two major options. Well, you know what, I'll throw a third in, but let's discuss the two options. Linux-based operating systems are the free alternative to Windows 10. Free in terms of cost, free in terms of freedom, right? So free has a double meaning here, but really when we talk about free, when we're talking about free and open source software, the free we're really referring to is free as in freedom. Although Linux distros, for the most part, are free in cost, they don't have to be. You can actually create a Linux distro and charge for it. There's nothing morally objectionable to charging for free and open source software. But it does need to be free as in freedom. That is the defining feature. Anyway, the term Linux technically only refers to the kernel. Well, that's from the author here. Yes, that is true. The actual operating system is GNU/Linux for our desktop Linux, but most people just shorten it. It just rolls off the tongue better. We just call our operating system Linux. When I say I run Linux, I'm running GNU/Linux, right? I'm not talking about Android Linux or Chromebook and Linux. I am running GNU/Linux, right? Anyway, I shouldn't have to explain to you why Linux is the best alternative if you're wanting to move away from Windows 10. I'll just give you a couple of the high points. Freedom, privacy, all the spyware that you got in Windows is no more. If you respect your privacy and security at all, Linux just makes sense. It is the best option. In a lot of ways, it's really the only option for you. Hardware compatibility. If you're running Windows, chances are that bit of hardware that's running Windows 10 is going to run Linux just fine. So Linux should install just fine. For the most part, we have enough good professional quality applications out there. We may not have the applications you're used to running. We may not have Microsoft Office in Linux. We don't. We don't have the Adobe suite of software, but you know what? We have alternatives to that sort of thing. And with the increased use of web-based applications like Office 365, for example, this is less of an issue for those of you that are just really married to the applications you've been using for years and years. Linux is going to have its own suite of applications. But for the most part, our applications are just as good, or in a lot of cases, better than what you were getting on Microsoft Windows. Valve has brought thousands of games to Linux. So those of you that are worried about gaming, moving from Windows and going to something like Linux, well, I'm not going to be able to game. Well, Valve now, there's something like almost 5,000 games now, I think, that run now on Steam, on Linux, thanks to Proton. So we're almost there as far as, the big complaints for people moving to Windows 10. The biggest ones I hear that are like the major deal breakers are usually Microsoft Office, Adobe Photoshop. Yeah, you're not going to get those, and there's no native clients on Linux for those particular programs, unfortunately. But the other big one is gaming. Gaming we've solved. So gaming we got you covered. The other operating system, obviously, that you could look into if you're wanting to move from Windows 10. The article mentions Mac OS. Mac OS is not really that viable for most people. For one thing, if you're going to run Mac OS, you need to go buy Apple hardware, right? You need to go buy a Mac Pro or a laptop, a MacBook Pro, or, some other, Mac device, Apple device. For most desktop users, you're already running Windows 10 on probably pretty decent hardware. What are you going to do? Get rid of that machine and go buy, some crazy expensive MacBook or Mac Pro just to switch operating systems? Why would you do that? Mac is a Unix-like operating system, but you know what? There is another Unix-like operating system out there that will install just fine on your PC, and that is Linux, right? So, if you're looking for an alternative to Windows 10 and you're thinking about Mac, I would strongly suggest you actually look at Windows first. One thing, it's going to save you a ton of money, but just on the hardware alone. Now, there are what they call Hackintosh builds out there where you can basically hack your way into installing the Mac OS on like PC hardware, but it's not easy to do. Some hardware is just completely incompatible with the Mac OS. So I don't know why you would fight with that sort of thing. It's such a big headache when most modern Linux distributions, things like Ubuntu, Fedora, Mint, Manjaro, install in 10 minutes and work out of the box. Why would you even think about doing something like a Hackintosh? It's beyond me. The other thing you need to be aware of is Hackintosh, putting Mac OS on non-Apple devices is not really aligned with Apple's terms and conditions. I don't know if they've ever really went after anybody for installing the Mac OS on non-Apple hardware, but it is something to be aware of. I mentioned that other than Linux and Mac OS, there was a third option that the article doesn't mention. I would briefly mention is Chrome OS is an alternative. Chrome OS is technically Linux. It has a Linux kernel. It runs the Gentoo Linux kernel that's built on Gentoo. So Chrome OS is also a viable option, and I would say if you're not going to do true Linux, Chrome OS is the next best operating system to try out. I would avoid Mac OS unless you're prepared to go buy expensive Mac hardware, but if you were willing to do that, you probably weren't running Windows 10 in the first place. And the fourth story on the docket tonight involves YouTube. I came across this story earlier today, and I thought, you know what? This story is very relevant for all of us because YouTube, of course, is my platform. It's how I do my videos, how I distribute all my content. It's also how many of you actually view not only my content, but most of your video content or live stream content. We're all on YouTube, right? So let's discuss some major changes coming to YouTube. So, bring in the ads. YouTube may let everyone watch original shows and film. So this is from Ars Technica. So YouTube has a subscription service that they used to call, I think, YouTube Red. Now it's called YouTube Premium. Like 10 or 12 bucks a month. You sign up for their premium service, and you got subscriptions to some of their music streaming services, and of course you've got some original content that YouTube was creating. The most popular was the Karate Kid series from a couple of months back, which was actually a great series. If you guys love the original Karate Kid film, the series they did, Cobra Kai, was fantastic. I'm not gonna lie. I actually, subscribed to the thing, watched it. Anyway, reading a little bit from the article, going against the grain. YouTube is reportedly scaling back its original content plans. So they've changed their mind on creating all this original content and trying to get, millions of subscriptions, from people, trying to, I guess, compete with things like Netflix and Hulu and whatnot. Anyway, the online video giant YouTube will scale back the volume of scripted original programming it produces by 2020. YouTube's new strategy, dubbed Single Slate, will combine ad-supported and subscription content, which will reportedly lead to its original shows and films becoming free for all to watch. So YouTube basically realized, you know what, we have such a huge platform, billions of people watch YouTube every year. Why are we trying to do all this with subscription services, trying to compete with things like Netflix, Hulu, Amazon, Spotify, for music subscription? They don't need to do that. I mean, they have, with their ad platform, they have the ability to make some serious cash with this. So, reading a quote here, as we look to 2019, we will continue to invest in scripted programming and shift to make our YouTube originals ad supported to meet the growing demand of a more global fan base. I think this makes a lot of sense. I think making it free, but of course with ads, that way, it's ad supported revenue that funds all of this. Because subscriptions, you're not going to get subscriptions from a lot of people. Obviously, in the first world countries, yeah, you might get some people that, can pay $12 a month for a YouTube subscription. But in many parts of the world, it's just not happening. You're better off just doing ad-supported revenue for these sorts of things. I think it's great because I'm actually looking forward to the second season of Cobra Kai. It would be great if I didn't have to pay for that thing. Anyway, with 2 billion users across the globe, YouTube has a huge audience for ad-supported content. So shifting focus to embrace that model may actually increase the number of viewers for each original show and film. Of course, it's going to increase the viewers. That goes without saying. If you're giving out something for free, obviously you're going to get a lot more viewers than if you charged for it. Anyway, the company isn't giving up on paywalled content. Reports suggest that YouTube may release episodes of scripted shows to all on a weekly basis, while premium subscribers get to binge on all episodes at their leisure. It makes sense. So if you're subscribed, you get like an on-demand kind of feature, where if you're not subscribed, you better be able to watch the show when it comes out. Maybe you have a certain period, a time window where you can watch it, but the premium subscribers get to watch it whenever. Makes sense, because you got to give the premium subscribers a perk. Otherwise, why am I subscribing, right? So, the company may also make exclusive bonus content, director's cuts of films, etc., available only to paid subscribers. Yeah, it's very similar to what content creators on YouTube itself do with, like patrons. Those of you of us that have Patreon accounts, we give patrons, bonus footage. Some people do, like full unedited shows where, the stuff they put on YouTube, of course, is heavily edited. But, for patrons, you get the full thing uncut with all the mistakes and cursing and everything. And so it sounds like that's kind of the model that YouTube itself is going to focus on. I think this is great. And the fifth and final story on the docket tonight. Discover the perfect Linux distro for you with this online tool. But does it really work? So I came across this reading Reddit the other day. LibreHunt.org is the name of the website. LibreHunt. It gives you a little blurb here, a little bit about Linux, safe, private, secure, choose Linux today. Wait, what is Linux? And then it tells you it's an operating system, it's private, safe, no tracking. It's a really, really great front page. I mean, it really, for like the brand new user that knows nothing about Linux, this is a nice introduction to Linux. It's got many flavors. Awesome. The actual term is distro, as in your own distribution of Linux. But it just means that anyone can make their own distribution flavor Linux. Okay, so tells you what a distro is. So then it says awesome, but there are 1 million Linux distros. That is an exaggeration, but there are definitely thousands of Linux distros out there. As far as distros that people kind of know about, there's about 300 or so Linux distros on DistroWatch. I'm assuming that's mostly what's going to be here. Maybe not even the full 300. Hopefully they narrowed this down to, more common distros. They're not going to hopefully suggest anything too obscure. But anyway, choose a distro today. New to Linux, no idea what to use, confused by the gazillions of distros out there? Click next to begin discovering your perfect distro out of our curated list, in quotes or in parentheses. So it is a curated list. Anyway, I'm going to click next because I know many of you are going to wonder, does this tool actually work? Let's see. First of all, Linux expertise. How good are you with computers? So I'm going to do this for me to see if it actually is going to recommend distros that are appropriate to me that I would actually run or that maybe I'm already running. So how good are you with computers and Linux? I would call myself an advanced user. Old hardware support. Do you need to run your distro on old hardware? I can't speak today. If I'm picking a distro for my main production machine, I don't really need it to support ancient hardware. So in this particular case, I'm going to say doesn't matter. Timely updates. Do you want app-like updates, as in updates as they come? So they're asking me, do I want a rolling release? Or OS-like updates, as in once in 6 months, like Ubuntu has a new release every 6 months, static release. So it's asking rolling release, static release. So I'm going to pick the rolling release model as they come. Lookalike. Do you want the distro to look like something, like another operating system like Mac OS or Windows? Or it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to me because I'm not going to make my Linux distro look like either Mac OS or Windows. Or I pretty much do my own thing. I install minimal window managers and create my own desktop that really doesn't resemble Windows or Mac in any way. So I'm going to choose none. Touch support. I don't have a touch screen. I'm going to install this on my desktop, not a laptop. So doesn't matter. Extreme security. For those okay with trading convenience for unusual amounts of security and privacy, so if you aren't an advanced user or a security freak, this is probably not something you need to select, and it's not something I would select. So I don't need extreme amounts of security. Just the normal Linux security is secure enough for me and probably with most of you. Popularity plus more support. Does it matter to me if the distro is popular? If it's more popular, it's going to have a bigger support channel, right? It's going to have more users on its forums, an IRC chat channel. I'm more likely to get good support. So things like Ubuntu are going to have fantastic support channels. Joe Bob's distro that he created last week with 2 of his buddies that no one's ever heard about. Not so great of a support network. For somebody like me, it doesn't matter because I'm my own support network. I never go to any forums or IRC chat channels or anything to find solutions to problems. I find my own solutions and fix them myself. So for me, I don't need popularity or support. It doesn't matter. Appearances. Would you want a unique experience and appearance the second you install it? So something with a typical stock appearance desktop. So do I want something with a little bling to it? So think things like Deepin, Elementary. Do I want a professional, polished desktop experience out of the box? For somebody like me, no, because I'm not going to use whatever desktop probably ships on that distro anyway. I'm going to install something else. I always do. I'm going to tinker. I'm going to hack on the thing. So I'm going to choose no. All right, hit the submit button to jump in and find some distros today. So I'm going to hit submit and see if it actually suggests distros that I would run. All right, distros found. All distros matching even a little of what you said. So let's start with the ones at the top. OpenSUSE Tumbleweed. I would say OpenSUSE Tumbleweed is a great match for somebody like me. I could see myself living in OpenSUSE Tumbleweed on my main production machine. No problems. Solus. Solus is another great match. I actually had Solus on my main production machine for a couple of weeks earlier in the year. I also ran it for 3 months on one of my laptops. Great distro. NixOS, I understand, the way I answered everything, why they would suggest something like NixOS to me. Not a distro I would run, but not a horrible selection based on the information I gave it. Slackware is a little strange of a choice because, I mentioned rolling release and things like that. Slackware, a much more stable distro. Gwix, I don't know anything about, so I won't comment on that. Mageia is a little bit of a strange choice too because it's not rolling release. Sabion's a great suggestion. Void is a great suggestion. Alpine, I haven't run Alpine, but it might be a good suggestion too. I won't go too much further because then we may start getting into things that don't quite match. Arch is another good match. Chakra, Manjaro, all Arch-based distros. So I will say the tool, at least for me, going through it this one time, did suggest pretty relevant distros. I mean, the first 12 or so distros that I looked at, other than the couple that I don't know too much about because I've never run personally, there were only a couple that I thought were strange choices. Slackware is a little strange. Mageia is a little strange. Other than that, the other 9 or 10 choices there in the top page. Yeah, so I kind of like the tool. I will link to the tool in the show description so you guys can try it out. And if you're looking for your next distro, might be the way to go. And that was the 5th and final story on the docket tonight. So this was Taking Into Account, episode 18. I try to release a new episode of Taking Into Account every Thursday. Work permitting. I have a rotating, alternating schedule at work where I never work the same schedule every week, so I never know when I can be here to physically record these. But I try to do this show once a week, and I try to release it sometime every Thursday. So this was episode 18. Look for episode 19 sometime next Thursday. Now, as always, other than the 5 main topics I cover, I like to read a viewer question or comment, usually a question or comment over on Mastodon. Sometimes questions or comments I get in email or YouTube comments. The question or comment I'm going to answer today is actually from multiple people. I got this question several times over the past week and a half. Many of you guys know I recently switched distros on my main production machine. I'm running Fedora 29. I'm actually running an edition of Fedora called Fedora Jam. And some of you guys are wondering how that's going. I've gotten that question several times over the past week. I will say this, Fedora 29, I've never been a Fedora user. I've tested Fedora a few times over the years. It's kind of a big distro, so it has a major release. I check it out in a VM. Sometimes I put it on a live USB stick. Check it out. I've never put it on physical hardware and tried to live in it, which is what I'm doing now. This is the very first time I've ever tried to live in Fedora. And I will say, I probably should have done this earlier because out of the box, everything is just working for me, at least in Fedora 29. Fedora Jam, the edition I'm using, runs KDE Plasma. Not a big fan of Plasma as a desktop environment, but that's beside the point. We're talking about Fedora, the distro, not Plasma, the desktop environment. I'm going to install probably Qtile or Xmonad or i3, or maybe go back to OpenBox, do a minimal window manager of my own and live in that rather than Plasma. I'm sticking with Plasma a little bit now, just, for a change of pace. But Fedora as a distro has been great. It was very easy for me to get all the software I need to produce the channel installed, things like the NVENC, NVIDIA encoders, the hardware encoder for things like OBS. It was a breeze to get that installed and working using the Jax server. Installing that, getting that working wasn't difficult at all. Anything I need is in the repos or in one of the third-party repos like the RPM Fusion repo or the United RPM repo. I've got both of those enabled. So Fedora 29, only been on it for about a week and a half, but so far I will say it's been fantastic. And before I go, this show was made possible by Ansem, Carlos, Chris, David, Leo, Rob, and Tony. They are the producers of the show. They are my highest tiered patrons over on Patreon. The show is also brought to you by all those fine ladies and gentlemen. You see all those names on the screen. They are the supporters of this channel. If you want to support this channel, if you enjoy the content you're seeing from this channel, please consider supporting DistroTube over on Patreon. Peace, guys.